the battle. The stage is set for a clash of two different armies, with King Harold holding the high ground against Duke William. The year is 1066. The crisp autumn air hangs heavy with the scent of fear and the promise of bloodshed. On a high ridge in Sussex, King Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, stands resolute, the very picture of his kingdom's defiance. His army, a formidable wall of shields, stretches across the highest point of the hill, a living barricade blocking the road to London. In a world on the cusp of a new age, Harold's force is a defiant echo of the past. The bulk of his men are the feared, farmers and yeomen who answered the call of their lord, armed with spears and their ancestral axes. Yet at the heart of the formation, a core of steel holds the line. Harold's elite housecarl guards, a brotherhood of professional warriors whose mighty two-handed Danish axes can cleave through a shield and a man in a single brutal swing. The king himself fights on foot, surrounded by his loyal bodyguard, a symbol of their unity and their grim resolve to hold their ground. Across the valley, Duke William of Normandy watches, a figure of cold, methodical ambition. His army is not a force of tradition, but a finely tuned instrument of conquest. This is the new way of war. William commands a highly trained force of professional knights, infantry, and crucially, archers and mounted cavalry, a military innovation that would soon dominate the battlefields of Europe for centuries. He has brought together a patchwork of fighters, the Bretons on his left, the French on his right, and his own Normans holding the center, a perfectly balanced force ready to adapt and overcome. The Norman army, though slightly outnumbered, represents the future, a stark contrast to the immovable but inflexible Saxon shield wall. The stage is set for an epic, brutal contest between the old and the new. Two men, two armies, two destinies, all about to collide on the bloody field of Hastings.
Clash of Titans. The battle begins with ineffective arrows and a brutal infantry assault on the unmovable English shield wall. A sudden, piercing blast from a dozen trumpets shatters the morning stillness, a sound that signals the beginning of the end for one king and the birth of a new dynasty. On William's order, the first wave of Norman archers steps forward, their bows drawing taut as one. An iron rain of arrows arcs high into the sky, a dark cloud descending upon the English shield wall. But the Saxon position is on the highest point of the ridge, and the steep slope works against the Normans. Most of the shafts fly high, passing harmlessly over the heads of the defenders, or simply thudding into the thick wooden shields. The iron tide breaks, scattering on the unbreakable stone of the English defense. Frustration mounts in the Norman ranks. The archers' assault has failed. William, seeing the futility of it, commits his main infantry force. Around 5,000 men begin their slow, methodical march up the hill, a disciplined line of heavy armor and grim resolve. They move in perfect unison, their footsteps a steady drumbeat against the earth, preserving their strength for the moment of impact. The Saxons on the ridge respond with their own volley of javelins and stones, but it is a meager response to the advancing steel. Then, with a sickening, resounding crash, the two armies collide. The sound is a monstrous mix of splintering wood, grinding metal, and guttural war cries. Men hack and stab in the narrow space, where every blow is meant to kill. The initial carnage is horrendous, a bloody meat grinder fueled by the raw energy of fresh fighters. The Normans, desperate for a breakthrough, throw themselves at the wall with a frenzy, seeking any weakness, any gap. But the Saxons hold firm. They do not need to advance, they only need to stand their ground. And for now, the shield wall, a living fortress of wood, hide, and defiance, will not yield. The Fateful Retreat. A panicked Norman retreat turns into a desperate rally led by William, saving his army from disaster. As the hours bled on, William watched his infantry struggle. The human tide of his assault was breaking against the immovable English shield wall, and the casualties were mounting. Seeing his men falter, he made a decision that would either win him a kingdom or cost him his life. He summoned his trumpets to sound the charge and ordered his mounted knights forward. With a thunderous roar and the shaking of the ground, the formidable Norman cavalry followed their duke into the fray, a wave of steel and horseflesh crashing against the human fortress. But even this ferocious assault could not break the English line. The Saxons held, their shields a wall of defiant oak and hide, their discipline unyielding. Then, a flicker of hope turned into a cascade of panic. On the far left, the Breton division began to buckle under the relentless pressure of the Saxon axes. Retreating at first, their flight triggered a domino effect. The entire Norman line began to falter and then fall back, a tide of fear sweeping across the battlefield. King Harold, seeing the opportunity, roared orders to his troops to hold the ridge, to not chase the fleeing enemy. But the taste of victory was too sweet for some. A small but fatal number of contingents on his right flank broke formation, abandoning their post to chase the retreating Normans down the slope. At that critical moment, a whisper of a rumor spread like wildfire through the Norman ranks. The Duke is dead. It was the final straw. Morale plummeted, and the retreat threatened to become a full-blown rout. But in the midst of the chaos, a lone figure stood out. William, Duke of Normandy, the very heart of the army, tore his helmet from his head. His face, streaked with sweat and grime, was a beacon of defiance. He rode along the line, shouting over the din of battle, "Look at me! I live! Fight on, and by God's help, we will conquer!" His charisma, his sheer audacity, and his courage stopped the panic in its tracks, pulling his army back from the brink of total disaster. The Deadly Ruse. William uses a feigned retreat to lure the undisciplined Saxon militia and break the shield wall. William's courage had not only stopped the rout, it had given him a new tactical idea. He gathered his rallied knights and galloped back toward the English flank that had broken ranks to chase his retreating men. The disobedient Saxons, flushed with victory, were now scattered and vulnerable on the open slope. The Normans turned on them, surrounding and cutting down every last man. It was a brutal lesson in discipline. The flight of his men, which had seemed so disastrous, had shown William the key to unlocking the English defense: their lack of discipline. After a brief lull in the fighting, William gave the order for a new kind of attack. It was a deadly game of feigned retreat. Norman mounted knights charged the Saxon shield wall, their lances poised, their shouts echoing across the valley. But at the last moment, before the clash, they would wheel their horses around and gallop back down the slope as if in panic. The disciplined English housecarls held their ground, seeing through the ruse. But they were few. The vast majority of the English army were the feared, the citizen militia. Less trained and less disciplined, they saw the retreating Normans as a sign of victory and broke their ranks to give chase. One by one, they abandoned the safety of the shield wall, their shouts of triumph turning to screams of terror as the seemingly retreating Norman knights turned on them, cutting them down in the open. With each successful feigned retreat, the Norman horsemen inflicted heavy casualties, especially on the irreplaceable housecarls, who were now mixed in with the less reliable feared. The English line, which for hours had been an immovable object, was now slowly being picked apart. The solid wall of shields became a sieve, full of gaps and vulnerable pockets. The once impenetrable English formation was finally crumbling, leaving them open to a final, devastating blow. The King's End. As the English line crumbles, King Harold falls to a tragic arrow, signaling the end of the Anglo-Saxon era. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in a bloody red, Duke William sensed the final moment had arrived. The English line, once a solid, defiant wall, was now a fractured, tired shadow of its former self. He saw the gaps and the weary faces of the furred militia and knew this was the time to strike the mortal blow. With a final, impassioned roar, William ordered a simultaneous all-out assault. Infantry, cavalry, and archers all moved as one against the battered Saxon ranks. This was it, the final push for the English crown. At the heart of the crumbling English line, King Harold fought on. He was a lion in the midst of the carnage, his battle banner held high above him as he wielded his sword with the strength of a legend. Surrounded by his most loyal guards, he stood resolute, a beacon of defiance in the face of inevitable defeat. He was the last hope of the Anglo-Saxon world, a king who fought alongside his men, determined to hold the line until his last breath. Then, in the chaotic maelstrom of the final assault, tragedy struck. It was not a charge, not a sword blow, but a single, silent moment that changed the course of history. A lone arrow, launched from an unknown bow, found its way through the swirling melee. It sailed through the air and struck Harold Godwinson in the eye, piercing his brain. He fell without a sound, a king brought down not by the steel of a knight, but by a simple shaft of wood and iron. Thus, in an instant, the life of the last Anglo-Saxon king of England was extinguished. The battle was over. Hope was lost. A dynasty had ended.
Aftermath of Conquest. William the Conqueror's triumphant march to London and his coronation. The news of Harold's death spread like a shockwave through the English ranks. The final, defiant bastion of the Anglo-Saxons crumbled in a moment. With their king and their hopes shattered, the weary, demoralized soldiers lost all will to fight. They broke formation and fled, melting into the surrounding woods, leaving behind a field of carnage and the broken promise of a kingdom. Duke William of Normandy was triumphant. The Anglo-Saxon army, which had stood so firm for so many hours, was utterly destroyed, unable to pose any further threat to his claim. For William, the battle was not the end of his journey, but the beginning. In the aftermath of the bloody victory, he wasted no time. He gathered his exhausted but victorious troops and marched them directly on London, the heart of the kingdom he now claimed. The capital, demoralized and without a king to lead its defense, swiftly fell. All remaining resistance was either squashed or surrendered. William's victory was complete. On Christmas Day, 1066, inside Westminster Abbey, William the Conqueror was crowned the first Norman king of England. The Anglo-Saxon era had come to a definitive, violent close, and a new age had dawned. An era of castles, chivalry, and a new language. This single, brutal battle not only won a crown, but permanently changed the course of England's history, and the man who orchestrated it all would forever be known by one name: William the Conqueror. This epic clash at Hastings was more than just a battle. It was a turning point for an entire civilization. It was a story of a kingdom won and lost on a single day. The battle showcased the stubborn strength of a bygone era, the power of the shield wall, and the bravery of a king who fought alongside his men. But it also proved the devastating, transformative power of military innovation. The mounted knight, the disciplined army, and the cunning tactical mind of a leader who could turn a chaotic retreat into a winning strategy. Harold Godwinson's tragic fall, brought down by an arrow, was a poignant symbol of his kingdom's fate. His defeat was not just the loss of a battle, but the end of a line, the final act of a story that had been written for centuries. William's victory, born from cunning and a heroic moment of leadership, was the beginning of a new chapter that would forever define England's identity. From the blood-soaked field of Hastings, a new nation would rise, forged from the brutal clash of Anglo-Saxon and Norman steel.